All right, we got just a few slides left, and they're about voice quality. So this is how a way to describe or characterize how your vocal folds vibrate during voicing. So it doesn't happen the same way all the time. Normally, when we speak, we produce what's called modal vibration, or at least most speakers do, which is why it's called modal. So it's like, ah, I've got a sample here. I'll turn that up a little bit. Yeah, so that's where your vocal folds kind of operate the way we've normally described them. So they are lightly adducted. The flow of air pops them open, and then because of the Bernoulli effect, they close, and you get this nice, really fast vocal trill or glottal trill, usually on the order of 100 hertz or higher in terms of frequency. You can contrast that with what we kind of heard with the Hindi samples, which is breathy voicing. So instead of the vocal folds being kept together nice and snug, you actually hold them apart a little bit, and then you crank up the airflow from the lungs, and the vocal folds will kind of wave in the wind. So they're not really touching in the normal fashion, and you get a lot of turbulent noise on top of the voicing pattern. And it's pretty distinctive when you hear it. Like that. Versus. Yeah. So I'll play you the third kind of voicing here before I give you these other samples. But the last kind is called creaky voice. I use creaky voice a lot. In fact, I was just doing it a second ago. So if you've ever listened to me talk, you may have observed this. But creaky voice, instead of being the vocal folds being close together or far apart, you actually kind of shorten them up and then push them so they're tight in the sort of the vertical dimension, but not as tight in the horizontal dimension. So what happens is that, sorry, did I get that backwards? Yeah, you loosen them up in this direction, then you hold them tight in the horizontal dimension. The exact opposite of what I just said. I apologize. And then so you push air out of the lungs at a very slow rate so that eventually the vocal folds will pop open kind of randomly, very slowly. And that gives you a very slow and irregular form of voicing where you can normally hear the individual glottal pulses coming out. Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I used to play around with this as a kid. You can, when I first wake up in the morning, I can make it go really, really slow so you can hear the individual pulses. There was a couple months ago where my 1-year-old child was playing around with this a lot too. It's just kind of fun. It's just a different kind of voice quality. What's also interesting about this, people have noticed that, in a previous generation perhaps, or maybe 2 previous generations ago, women were typically thought to have breathy voice. I've got a couple samples of what that sounds like here from, you can probably figure out who this is.
Oh, I wouldn't mind to wear glasses.
And you can hear that breathiness there.
Oh, I wouldn't mind to wear glasses.
That's Marilyn Monroe from the 7-Year Itch. Here's another Marilyn Monroe sample.
Happy birthday to you.
Yeah, so the use of breathy voice kind of has particular, paralinguistic connotations, you might say. Creaky voice is heard a lot more frequently in the speech of women nowadays. I've got some samples of relatively younger speakers, of female speakers using creaky voice here.
This is actually like an apartment building. It's weird. We're like on the 3rd floor.
So that may sound sort of familiar.
And I mean, they broke up and got back together like 5-6 times, something like that.
But often when you ask listeners what they think, they'll associate creaky voice more often with male voices because it's just a very low fundamental frequency to begin with, much lower than you normally observe for, say, modal F0 for female speakers. And I can't stop doing it now that I'm thinking about it. Anyways, here's what it looks like in a spectrogram. This is just breathy by itself. And again, what you see is periodic voicing and then also turbulence on top of that. So we get some turbulent noise, and we also get, what we see with a voiced fricative normally, we get these periodic vibrations or vertical stripes indicating the glottal pulses, the glottal openings and closings of voicing there. Some of you speak with breathy voice a lot. I hate to break it to you, but that makes your job of measuring your performance more difficult. What you typically see with breathy voicing, so this is an ah. This is F1 here for the ah. This is F2. What happens is that the higher frequencies tend to lose a lot of intensity with breathy voice. And that shows up in weaker formants up here, which are kind of harder to spot. And you also often get this kind of phantom formant down at the bottom, which is basically the F0. So this is not F1 here. This is F1. This is F2. It just kind of jumps out because normally F1 is pretty high for an ah, leaving room for you to see this F0. So be aware of that. If you do speak with breathy voice, you'll be able to see if you speak with breathy voice if you get this sort of turbulent pattern superimposed on top of the voicing. And by the way, the diacritic for breathy voice is these two dots underneath the vowel or whatever segment is being breathy voiced. Sounds like that. This is me doing creaky voice really regularly, which is kind of not the way you normally hear it, but you can see pretty clearly these individual openings and closings of the vocal folds as you go through. And they're irregular. You can see them kind of fading in and out in terms of intensity. But there's no phantom formant down here for creaky voice. You can usually see the formants pretty easily. In fact, this one even has a little bit of a gap here in between F1 and F2 for ah, which doesn't normally happen. The diacritic for creaky voice is this little tilde underneath the vowel symbol or whatever symbol is being creakified. Here's me going from modal to creaky in a sample of ah. Which is something more like you would normally see in normal utterance of English, where, say, at the end of an utterance, people will drop their F0 eventually till it gets to the point where it descends into creak. And it's really easy to pick that out in a spectrogram where you go from this nice regular modal voicing to all of a sudden things get kind of random and sporadic here in terms of both timing and intensity. And you can see it's very slow because you can pick out these individual glottal pulses as well. Yeah, I've got some voice quality movies so you can see how this works with the vocal folds. So these are these laryngoscopic videos. I can't remember which ones we've seen so far, so I'm going to start off with this this one, which shows you just regular voicing and changing the pitch. And sorry, that's not the clearest thing in the world, but basically this kind of shows you that when you have higher pitch, you stretch out the vocal folds, which makes them more tense. And when you have lower pitch, you kind of release that tension and they get shorter. These are the vocal folds, right? And here's what it looks like for modal voicing. So close together and popping open regularly. Actually, they're opening and closing so fast, you can't really see the individual openings and closings. Normally for a male speaker, I don't know exactly what this F0 is, but it's probably around 120 hertz. When you film something, you actually take a still picture 30 times every second. So it's the frequency rate or the sampling rate of video is normally 30 hertz or about that. So if you take a picture only once every or 30 times a second and the opening and closings are happening 120 times a second, you're going to get basically a blur of openings and closings for each frame that you take 4 at once. So you can't get a good, really clear picture of that. But you can get a clear enough picture when you look at the breathy voice to see that the vocal folds are further apart from each other than what we saw in modal voice.
First of all, normal and then breathy. E, E, E. Normal again. E. Breathy. E, 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 E.
Yeah, so it kind of becomes like a monster that's coming closer and closer to you there at the end. But one thing you can see here,
Breathy.
number one, you can see that the vocal folds are fairly far apart. You also can see that the vocal folds, when it is of high enough quality, that they're kind of grayish in color because they're ligaments rather than muscle tissue. You can also see, this is something we unfortunately didn't get a chance to see because the larynx field trip was canceled this year, but There's a bit of a nodule on this guy's vocal folds too, which kind of prevents the vocal folds from making nice tight closure anyways, and gives this guy kind of a default sort of breathy voice because there's always going to be a little bit of gap between his vocal folds. Lastly, I'll show you his creak.
Normal phonation first. E, and then vocal creak. E, e,
So shortening in this dimension, tightening in this dimension. We'll do that one more time.
Normal phonation first. E, and then vocal creak.
I'm going to add here one other thing that you learn from the larynx field trip is just how small the vocal folds are. They're basically about that long, if that. And it's just kind of amazing when you see them to think about how much noise or sound you can create with something that is that tiny, stuck in the middle of your throat. But it's got a lot to work with, your lungs and everything else, the vocal tract itself too. Anyways, why am I talking about this? There are some languages that contrast different types of voice qualities at a segmental level. So Gujarati, which is a language spoken in Western India, I think, primarily, but also, in places like Canada too. That is a language that contrasts breathy voiced vowels with modal voiced vowels. So listen carefully to this. You should be able to pick it up.
Mel, 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 mel.
So this is the m, and this is the
mel, mel.
And you denote that with the little diacritic underneath the vowel. There's also a language called Jalapa Mazatec, which is spoken in southern Mexico, which has a three-way contrast between modal, breathy, and creaky voiced vowels. So you can hear the creak here, and the breathy voice here. And it kind of gets associated with the stop before it a little bit, but that's how it sounds. And that's also why we have these diacritics in the IPA for transcribing these different types of segments. And that's where I'm going to stop for today. I think that's enough for now. We're going to move on to stop acoustics in the next lecture, which is kind of closely related to this stuff. So we can look forward to that. See you then.